Every culture is shaped by behavior. What we tolerate, what we avoid, and what we are too uncomfortable to confront. I'm here to confront it. You've heard the word dominatrix, and you thought it meant fantasy, of course. But it means responsibility. It means discipline. It means clarity in places most people choose confusion. Because when power is misunderstood, it becomes harm. And when boundaries aren't spoken, they're violated. So we descend, not into darkness, but into honesty, into the conversations you avoid, into the patterns you repeat, into the truths that shape your relationships, your families, your future. This isn't about shock. It's about correction. It's about learning how to enforce consent, how to set limits, how to communicate through discomfort, how to hold power without abusing it. If we don't talk about it, it controls us. But if we can face it, we can grow. If you're ready to confront what most people won't, please walk with me. Let's fix what we've been avoiding. This is Confessions of a Dominatrix. This is Confessions of a Dominatrix, episode 17. The culture of reaction. Why we escalate instead of resolve. Opening. Why everything feels so loud right now. There's a reason so many interactions feel heavier than they should. Why small disagreements escalate. Why silence feels uncomfortable. Why people seem quicker to react and slower to recover. It isn't that we've all suddenly lost emotional intelligence. And it isn't that people are weaker than they used to be. It's that most of us are living inside environments that never let our nervous systems settle and reset. We're moving through days filled with constant input, information, opinions, stimulation, urgency, and very little space to metabolize any of it. So when something finally does demand a real emotional response, it hits. It hits the system like a bomb, like an immense overload. This episode isn't about blame, and it isn't about nostalgia of a calmer time. It's about recognizing what we're swimming in, how our emotional thresholds are being shaped, why regulation is becoming a lost skill, and what happens to individuals and societies when staying present becomes harder than reacting. Because before we can talk about conflict, control, escalation, or collapse, we have to talk about the conditions that make all of those things more likely. And that starts with honesty about the environment we're asking ourselves and each other to survive in. Section 1. Emotional triggers are not an accident. we need to be honest about something before we go any further. Most of what surrounds us right now is designed to trigger us emotionally. Not incidentally, not accidentally, on purpose. Our phones, social media, news cycles, anything that gets your attention, ads, entertainment, they are not designed to regulate you, or us for that matter. They are designed to activate us. Outrage, fear, desire, validation, comparison, shock. Those are the currencies they're using. And there are very few regulations in place to prevent this. Not because we're careless, but because we asked for this. We asked for this way. We wanted it faster. We wanted it easier. We wanted it more stimulating. We wanted it more entertaining. We wanted the rush, the hit, the instant feedback loop. That little artificial spike of dopamine. That quick hormone boost that feels like relief, but isn't. So now we live inside systems that are engineered to keep our nervous systems slightly or severely dysregulated all day long. And because it feels normal, we don't question it. We scroll instead of settling. We react instead of reflecting. We consume instead of processing. And then we wonder why stillness feels unbearable. This isn't a personal failure. It's an environmental one. Section 2. Addiction isn't always a substance. This is where the word addiction needs to be reframed. Addiction isn't always about drugs or alcohol. It's about reliance. If something becomes the primary way you avoid discomfort, regulate emotion, or escape internal sensation, it functions as an addiction. That's the purpose you give it. And right now, emotional avoidance is being fed at an industrial scale. We are addicted to not feeling bored, not feeling lonely, not feeling sad, not feeling uncertain, not feeling powerless. So we reach for stimulation instead. Not because we're weak, but because it's everywhere and it works. Every swipe gives you a tiny chemical reward. Every notification gives you a sense of importance. Every argument gives you adrenaline. Every fantasy gives you escape. And there is no incentive for the systems that profit from this to slow it down. There is no incentive to encourage regulation. There's no incentive to teach emotional tolerance. There is no incentive to teach people how to sit with themselves. Because regulated people don't click as much. They don't buy as much impulsively. They don't react as predictably. So instead, we're trained subtly, constantly, to stay slightly activated. And over time, that changes us. It lowers our tolerance for stillness. It lowers our capacity for grief. It lowers our ability to sit with discomfort. So when something real happens, death, loss, silence, pain, people panic. Not because they're broken, but because they've been conditioned away from the skill of staying. And that's the part no one wants to talk about. Section 3. The job nobody trains you for. The ability to sit with discomfort isn't a personality trait. It's a skill. And for some people, it became a job long before they understood it that way. People who can sit with grief, silence, conflict, tension, or emotional weight usually weren't protected from it. They weren't distracted out of it. They weren't rescued every time something got uncomfortable. They learned, slowly, sometimes painfully, how to stay. Stay present. Stay regulated. Stay grounded when nothing feels good. Not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. That skill doesn't come from theory. It comes from repetition, from being the one who didn't leave, the one who didn't panic, the one who didn't escalate. And this isn't about being morally superior. It's about exposure and responsibility. If you've had to manage real consequences, real outcomes, you develop a pacing system inside your body. You learn how long emotion lasts, how intense it gets before it peaks, how to breathe through it instead of fleeing it, how to let it move through you instead of swallowing you. That's not detachment. That's nervous system literacy. People who can sit with discomfort aren't numb. They're regulated. They understand that pain doesn't automatically mean danger. They understand that silence isn't abandonment. They understand that that stillness isn't collapse. And because of that, they don't rush to control the moment. They simply stay. And staying is work. It requires restraint. It requires attention. It requires humility. And humility in its purest form. And humility is what most people are trying to avoid. Section 4. What happens when no one can stay? When no one in a situation can tolerate discomfort, escalation becomes inevitable. Grief doesn't get processed. It gets buried. Fear doesn't get acknowledged. It gets projected. Anger doesn't get metabolized. It gets aimed. And when an entire culture loses the ability to sit with emotion, the consequences are not just emotional. They become structural. People stop clarifying and start choosing sides. They stop resolving and start performing. They stop slowing down and start reacting. Small misunderstandings become moral crises. Disagreements become threats, Silence becomes suspicious, and the loudest, most reactive person ends up steering the room. Not because they're right, but because everyone else is uncomfortable. Children don't learn regulation because adults don't model it. Communities fracture because repair feels too exposed. Institutions grow rigid because vulnerability feels unsafe. When no one can stay, everything gets louder, harsher, faster. And that's where we're at. Not because people are evil, but because they're unpracticed at being human in pain together. Section 5. Why some people run toward control instead. When people can't tolerate emotion, they don't become passive. They become controlling. Control is not confidence. It's just a coping strategy. For some people, especially those rewarded for dominance or decisiveness, emotion feels like exposure. Empathy feels destabilizing. Uncertainty feels dangerous to them. So instead of learning how to sit with this discomfort, they override it. They tighten rules. They demand compliance. They escalate quickly. They dominate conversations. They need the last word. Because control quiets the internal chaos, temporarily, to them anyways. That's why control-oriented people often struggle most when things go wrong or they get emotional. And especially with emotion, their systems fail. When empathy is required, not advice, not solutions, not logic, but brutal emotional presence, they short circuit. They don't know what to do with grief that can't be fixed. Sadness that can't be rationalized. Fear that doesn't respond to authority. So they minimize. They redirect. They intellectualize everything. They become impatient. They try to shut it down, not because they're malicious or have bad intentions, but because empathy requires tolerating emotion without controlling it, and they can't do that. That's a skill they were never taught. For control-oriented people, emotion feels like chaos. Empathy feels like losing your footing. So instead of attuning to everything, they manage it. Instead of listening, they correct. They can command a room, they can enforce structure, but ask them to sit quietly with a crying child, a grieving partner, an anxious employee, and discomfort surfaces immediately. Because emotion cannot be dominated. It can only be held. And holding requires regulation, not authority. Section 6. Containment is not control. Containment and control are not the same thing. Control is imposed from the outside. Containment is held from the inside. Control says, stop, Do what I say. This needs to end. Containment says, I can stay. We can move through this. Nothing catastrophic happens if we slow down. Control tries to eliminate emotion. Containment allows emotion without letting it hijack behavior. Control is about winning the moment. Containment is about resolving it. Containment requires humility. It requires someone to care more about solution than pride. And that's where escalation breaks down. Escalation does not solve anything. It leaves the issue unresolved, and it leaves everyone dysregulated. Most conflicts are not rooted in evil intent. They're rooted in miscommunication, misinterpretation, unchecked assumptions. But resolution cannot happen until emotion settles. And emotion does not settle when both people are trying to win. Someone has to stay first. Someone has to care enough to slow it down. If one person pauses, clarifies, apologizes for confusion, acknowledges any impact, the entire trajectory of the conflict shifts. Most people do not want a fight. They don't want constant tension. They don't want escalation. But culturally, we glamorize reaction. We've done that. There's a moment in Fight Club, the movie, where one assignment is to start a fight with a stranger and lose. That psychology is fascinating. Because imagine initiating conflict and then physically losing on purpose. The humiliation. How humbling that is. The identity shift that happens. The disruption that happens. How would you speak afterward? How would you carry yourself? What would your posture be the next day? You wouldn't be puffed up. You'd be reflective. That perspective shift strips ego. It exposes how much conflict is really about pride rather than resolution. And perspective is what allows someone to regulate instead of escalate things. We only learn how to affect others when we're willing to experience discomfort from a different angle. That's the only way we coexist, and we can make it possible to coexist. Closing. The skill we're losing. If everything feels louder right now, it's not an accident. We are being conditioned to react. But reacting is not resolving. Control is not containment. Escalation is not strength. And dominance is not leadership. Regulation is. The person who can stay, who can slow the moment down, who can clarify instead of accuse, who can apologize instead of posture. That person changes outcomes. That person prevents structural collapse. That person keeps things from becoming life or death. when they definitely don't have to be. De-escalation needs to become the trend, not escalation, not reaction, not outrage, not dominance. Because when we choose to respond instead of react, clarify instead of attack, stay instead of flee, things resolve. Progress is made. And that's how we keep each other safe.